Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Education. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. Welcome to our webinar, Education Innovations, Microschooling. For nearly 30 years, the Commonwealth state-led K-12 education reform work has been a historic success, leading us to be #1 in the country in NAEP reading and math since 2005, while also being the only state that's internationally competitive in math and science. We've also been home to the nation's best charter public, Catholic, and voc tech school choice options. Nevertheless, a decade of decline in education policymaking combined with poor quality remote learning during the COVID pandemic and horrendous 2022 NAEP scores has awakened parents to the grave deficiencies in public school offerings. For example, over 37,000 Massachusetts students left the traditional public schools during COVID, migrating to charter, Catholic, voc tech, and homeschooling options. That means about 10,000 students more than are enrolled in the Bay State's second largest school district, Springfield, were dissatisfied with their K-12 education. Across the country, it's the same story. In state after state, parents aren't happy with the public education their children are receiving. In 2021, called the Year of School Choice, over 20 states added or expanded educational voucher, tax credit, and education savings account programs. Meanwhile, according to PBS, the number of homeschooling students nationally increased by 63% in the 2020-2021 school year, then fell only by 17% in the 2021-2022 school year. Commonwealth Magazine wrote, according to the numbers released by the Mass Department of Education, there were 17,000 students homeschooled in Massachusetts during the 2020-2021 school year. That compares to 7,000 children who were homeschooled in 2019-2020 and similar numbers the prior 2 years. Clearly, state and national trends are moving more and more towards a wider variety of school choice options, with particular progress in homeschooling, microschools, and pods. In the 1990s, Pioneer was an incubator for the nation's leading charter school sector. Today, we think it's vitally important that policymakers cultivate and encourage other parent-driven school choice efforts, as well as serving as a convener for the next wave of educational entrepreneurs, including microschool leaders. That's why in late 2022, we were pleased to publish the policy brief, Why Massachusetts Should Be a Leader in Encouraging Education Entrepreneurship and Innovation, K-12 Learning Models, by national expert Kerry McDonald. Some of the microschool leaders she profiled in that paper are joining us today. We hope this webinar helps to educate policymakers and educational innovators alike, and why we're so honored to share this afternoon's lineup. Kerry McDonald is a Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at SPN, and author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. Amar Kumar, founder and CEO of KaiPod Learning. Shiren Rattigan, lead educational curator, founder, and owner of Colossal Academy. And Ashley Soifer, Chief Innovation Officer at the National Microschooling Center. We're pleased to begin with Kerry McDonald.
Thank you, Jamie, for the introduction and for all of your efforts over the years, leading Pioneer Institute's Center for School Reform and really working to expand education options for families. Thank you to Pioneer for hosting today's webinar. And thanks to all of you who are joining us today over Zoom from across the US. It's a real pleasure to have you here to talk about education entrepreneurship and microschooling in particular. A special welcome to today's 3 panelists who are showing what is possible when education entrepreneurs set out to reimagine K-12 learning. Shiren, Amar, and Ashley are not only innovative educators themselves, but they're really helping to activate education entrepreneurs across the country who are creating this wide assortment of individualized bottom-up education solutions that families are really increasingly gravitating towards. So I will be moderating today's conversation and asking Shiren, Amar, and Ashley a variety of questions related to education entrepreneurship and microschooling. But first, I thought I would talk a bit about what I have come to call the 3 E's of education transformation that have characterized the past 3 years. So those E's are empowerment, exit, and entrepreneurship. So starting with empowerment, I think it's really interesting to note that exactly 3 years ago today, on March 15th, 2020, then Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker ordered all schools in Massachusetts to be closed for 3 weeks. Of course, we know that was just the beginning, and schools remained shuttered throughout the spring of 2020, and in some cases into the fall of 2020 and beyond. But that was a real moment, I believe, of parent empowerment, that through district Zoom schooling, parents really got a sense of what was happening in their children's classrooms. And some of it they didn't like. I heard some parents say, gee, I didn't realize that my children were, encountering academic content that they had really mastered previously. So they felt that maybe there wasn't that kind of level of academic rigor. So all kinds of sort of eye-opening observations that parents discovered during district Zoom schooling. And of course, ongoing frustration with school shutdowns and related COVID policies. But that led parents to really be empowered to start thinking about alternatives and thinking about different ways of learning and what education could look like beyond an assigned district school. So we saw, beginning in the summer of 2020, the rise of pandemic pods, these sort of parent-organized, spontaneous, bottom-up solutions of parents getting together and figuring out ways to enable their children to gather safely, but have that kind of social engagement and academic rigor and opportunity. In some cases, parents took turns leading these pods. In other cases, they hired an educator to lead these pods. And there was more and more interest, particularly as schools remained closed in the fall of 2020, in homeschooling. And so that's really what led to kind of that second E of exit. And Jamie mentioned the 37,000 students here in Massachusetts that left district schools during the COVID response. A new paper by Stanford economist Thomas D. found that nationally, there were more than 1.2 million students that left district schools during those first 2 years of the pandemic. Most went to homeschooling in private schools. In fact, D found that for every for every one student that entered a private school during that time, 2 students chose homeschooling. So there was just an enormous growth in homeschooling, and Jamie provided some of the data here in Massachusetts. The U.S. Census Bureau also found a more than doubling of the homeschool population in the early days of the COVID response, and a 5-fold increase in the number of Black homeschooling families at that time, to the point where Black homeschoolers were overrepresented in the homeschool population nationally compared to their representation in the overall K-12 public school population. And I think what we saw coming from both empowerment of parents and exit was this sort of desire for other education options, and thinking about maybe there could be different ways that education could be funded, could be accessible, that different models could be available to more students. And so that empowerment combined with exit led to that increased push for school choice. Jamie mentioned the 2021 year of school choice, but that was followed really by 2022 with the passage of Arizona's Universal Education Savings Account, the first universal ESA in the country that enables all students in Arizona to access about $7,000 a year to use toward educational expenses, including tuition at traditional private schools, or to homeschooling supplies, tutoring services, educational therapies, learning pods, such as those that Amar will talk to us about, microschools, or what are intentionally small, typically mixed age, personalized learning environments like the one Shiren created and will tell us about, and like those that Ashley helps to support. And already this year, 2023, looks to be the new year of school choice, with several states recently introducing and passing sweeping legislation that enables education to follow students and expand learning options for families. But empowerment and exit are really only possible when there are choices, and that's where the final E, entrepreneurship, comes into focus. The COVID response really activated everyday education entrepreneurs across the country to create these new K-12 learning models. And we start thinking about, for example, what Shiren has created with Colossal Academy in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So Shiren was a public school teacher. She taught in the Chicago public schools, moved into teaching at a private school and then a private Montessori school in Florida. And when the schools shut down, she was doing a bit of work still kind of remotely through that Montessori school, but then she had parents approach her and ask if she would create a pod, if she would lead a pod that was Montessori inspired. And so she did, and that evolved into her full established microschool in Fort Lauderdale. Many of her students attend on Florida's generous tax credit scholarship program, enabling low-income families to access this model. And again, microschools tend to be a fraction of the cost of traditional private options, but still inaccessible financially to some families. So she's able to do that through Colossal, and she's continuing to expand now her microschool network, as well as really being a beacon for other education entrepreneurs, not only in South Florida, but really across the country, and helping them to create new microschools and new innovative learning models. And Amar, too, found during this COVID time that it was a time to really activate, catalyze education entrepreneurship. Amar has a background in business, an MBA from Harvard Business School, consulting experience with McKinsey, followed by several years as the head of product development for Pearson Online. And in 2021, he ended up going through the prestigious Y Combinator Startup Accelerator program in Silicon Valley with the idea for KaiPod that would really bring the best of online learning and the customization involved with online learning and enabling families to choose the curriculum that really matched their individual preferences and values, but bring students together in an in-person learning environment with other students and adult facilitators who could answer questions, provide enrichment opportunities, really create that space for collaborative learning. And KaiPod is now still has their inaugural pod that's in Newton, Massachusetts, but really expanding elsewhere, particularly in states that have robust school choice policies like Arizona. And then Ashley Soifer, as Jamie mentioned, she is the co-founder and chief innovation officer for the National Microschooling Center, which is based in Las Vegas. She and her co-founder husband, Don Soifer, originally created Microschooling NV, Microschooling Nevada, to activate microschools in Nevada, and created an award-winning public-private partnership microschool with the city of North Las Vegas during COVID. So the National Microschooling Center is really kind of branches beyond that. They saw a need for more national reach and supporting microschool founders and entrepreneurs across the country. But they're, of course, still based in Las Vegas, which is like South Florida, where Shiren is a real hub of microschools and education entrepreneurship. In Las Vegas alone, within the 10-mile radius around the Strip in Las Vegas, there are roughly 25 microschools serving more than 300 students. And I think, as Ashley will tell us, she expects that number will more than double over the next 18 months to over 600 students being served in, again, these intentionally small, very personalized, low-cost private education options. Ashley's also the parent of 3 children who now attend a Las Vegas microschool after being at a charter school. So it's been 3 full years now of parent empowerment, exit, and entrepreneurship. And I'd like to get into a broader conversation of microschooling and education on innovation and entrepreneurship with our 3 panelists. So Shiren, let's start with you. You were a classroom teacher, as I mentioned, in both public and private schools. You didn't intend to create a pandemic pod or a microschool, but now you're running Colossal Academy and looking to expand that. What is it about the microschool model that you think is particularly appealing?
Thank you so much, Kerry, for having us. So, I think within the adolescent age, it's really important that we are able to actually focus in on young people and activate their voices and put them in the community. What I've found is being able to be agile and nimble by maintaining our smallness allows me to move the model as the students need. So I really center the students in the decision-making of how to build the curriculum. So last year we were on a farm because they were really into nature and farming, and this year we're in downtown Fort Lauderdale and focusing on art and entrepreneurship because that's what's at the forefront, and I can pivot as I need to. So in a traditional classroom, if my students wanted drones, I would have to go to the director, and then we would have to go to district. It could be 2 years before we got drones inside of our classroom, and then the kids are gone, right? The other part is to be able to evolve with them. So I see the kids over the years, right? And as they start to bloom in who they're supposed to be and start to actualize and become who they're meant to be, and then they're able to specialize in high school. So I have a student, I just got the news that he got accepted to a very prestigious program for STEM and computer science. So he is a cybersecurity. He'll get his certification in a couple of weeks here. And really just being able to move with him while I have other kids who are just like, I want to build bath bombs, right? And that all can exist in a small space, but it doesn't work on a large scale. So I think definitely within that age group, but also deeper connection. We need to have deeper connection with each other, with the families. I know every single child's family dynamics when someone is having an allergic reaction to something in the house, right? Like I know everything that's happening and why I might be sleepy that day. When I was in the traditional system, I'd be like, oh, he's sleeping, wake up. You know, like there was no empathy or time even to get to know every single child, what makes them tick, why they might be sleeping, right? And kids nap now. If they need a nap, they go pull out a yoga mat, they take a breath for 10, 15 minutes, and then they get back to work. And that really works with growing adolescents. They're caterpillars. They're eating all the time. They're like becoming the butterflies that they need to become. And I just think that the micro model works the best because they're able to have great peer-to-peer interactions and also center their voice and activate it into the communities by being change makers. So that's a bit about myself and microschooling and why I think it's the best model, especially for adolescents.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Shiren, because you work mostly with middle schoolers. You have about 30 middle schoolers in Colossal Academy, continuing to think about ways to expand and grow that model. You also work with students online separately in a global classroom. But really, building those connections. This is a 5-day-a-week program. Again, students are able to attend on the tax credit scholarship policies there that make it financially accessible to you, but does have that personalized, small, nurturing feel that is different, it sounds like, from both the traditional public and private school backgrounds that you came from. And Amar, maybe we could turn to you now and hear a little bit about what prompted you to develop this model for KaiPod. Tell us a little bit more about what it is and why you think it's such an appealing model for today's families.
Sure. Thanks, Kerry, and thank you to Pioneer for having me. I started off as a school teacher. I've been in the classroom. I was a school building principal at one point. And in those experiences, I realized what every educator realizes, that you've got this beautiful diversity of kids in front of you who've got academic needs that are so different from each other. And you as one teacher, one voice, can't really meet every single need every single day. And that just every day caused me to feel like a failure, that I was doing the wrong thing, or I wasn't really meeting the needs of every child. And so there's something about traditional brick and mortar instruction, I don't care if it was public or private, traditional brick and mortar instruction that didn't feel right. That led me into the world of online schools or online learning through a company called Connections Education. So if you've heard of Connections Academy, there's a school in Massachusetts. And that's where I really discovered, okay, students can learn at their own pace. They move through content in the manner and in the order that's right for them. And there are online teachers supporting that journey. And so for me, something clicked and said, okay, this could be part of the future. This is what we should do more of. So I became the leader of that team. I built that technology product and the curriculum. And then, of course, as everyone else also realized during the pandemic, that it's not enough to be completely online, to be completely personalized, because that created a lot of isolated students. It created a lot of challenges with socialization or lack of mental health supports for those kids. Those parents often needed extra supports. And so then I could see that there was something missing in what we had built at Connections. And so that's where the idea for KaiPod came in. Is all these parents during the pandemic creating pods, and said, oh, like what if you could merge the idea for a pod with the idea for these wonderful online schools that already exist? And so our first KaiPod was targeting students enrolled in online schools who wanted extra socialization. Their parents wanted the students to be somewhere during the school day, and they needed extra academic support. And then through that, we've been evolving the model to now also include homeschoolers who don't necessarily want to opt into a single online school, but they want to pull from different learning resources. And so the model has grown organically as we've learned and spoken to more families.
It's just great. Thanks, Amar. So Ashley, maybe you can help us a bit with definitions. We try to avoid defining too closely what microschooling is, what a pod is, what are the similarities and differences, because as I think you'll share, this is often sort of self-identified. What does an individual education entrepreneur kind of identify as? What does their community gravitate toward? But maybe you could start by sharing a little bit about some definitions as part of the National Microschooling Center. What do you think of as a microschool? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Kerry and Pioneer. I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk about microschooling. And you're right, we do try to avoid definitions. We think that defining microschooling right now will only limit its potential. It's such an exciting movement with so many amazing people doing incredible work. And the idea of defining it and sort of restricting its growth is something that we're very mindful of. So it really is a lot of people that identify as microschoolers, right? If you're a microschool leader, you can be it can be done as a private school arrangement, a homeschool arrangement, in some cases within charter schools or public school districts. So just really, it's about, for the most part, being flexible, right? Like both Shiren and Amar were mentioning, it's adapting to the kiddos. It's tailoring an education around those the children that you're serving, that child's particular needs, as well as being very relationship based. So microschool leaders, again, like Shiren mentioned, right? She knows when a kiddo's having an allergic reaction at their house, like she knows what's going on. And that's what we find with all of our microschool leaders, is that they develop these close-knit relationships with their families. And for me personally, as a parent, it's been so exciting to have the microschool facilitators feel like an extension of family, right? We're not just sending kiddos off for 8 hours a day and wondering, what's going on, but assuming it's all being taken care of at school, and we get them back at the end of the day and kind of do school at home with homework and barely have time to have dinner and take a shower, go to bed and do it all over again. And now it's so much more involvement. So really, microschooling is all about who identifies as a microschooler, but having those close relationships and adapting to meet the needs of the kids that you're serving.
Great. So we'll continue with you, Ashley, and talk a little bit about the diversity of the microschooling movement. Again, microschooling broadly defined could include small learning pods. It could include private schools, even up to 100 or more students. It could include homeschool resource centers and homeschool collaboratives, but who have this sort of focus on personalized learning, often in these mixed age environments. There's a tremendous diversity in terms of the education entrepreneurs who are running these programs, as well as the educational philosophies and approaches that they embrace. I know your children attend a self-directed microschool in the Las Vegas area. That's certainly my educational preference and what I write about in my Unschooled book, but that's just one of many approaches and philosophies. There's faith-based microschools, there's classical microschools, there's eclectic, kind of a combination of different models. I wonder if you can speak to that assortment and what you think makes that so powerful.
Absolutely. I think that is really what's so exciting about the microschooling movement, is that it's not about taking a particular model and replicating it. It's about building the program for the needs of the learners and community that you're serving. And so there's room for everybody. Everybody is welcome, and there's a space for every microschool founder, because that will mean that there is a space for every child to find somewhere where they can thrive and be successful. And for some children, that does mean a self-directed learning environment where you could go and the kiddos really do tailor their learning and they're in charge of their academics. Or it could mean something that looks a little more conventional or a little more traditional. And there's a space for all of this in the movement. And it's really about finding what works for you as a founder and what works for your families, and just creating that small learning environment that your kiddos will thrive in. But as we're talking to different leaders throughout the nation, yes, we're seeing everything from self-directed to something that looks far more traditional and everything in between. And that really is what's so exciting, because within the microschooling movement, we encourage families, if they need to move around, to move around. It's not about you waited on a wait list at this school and you finally got your seat and you're afraid to go and try something different because your seat might be gone. It's about finding what works for your child. And it's also not needing to have the whole education plan for your child planned out from the moment that they enter kindergarten, which as a parent, that's what I felt like. Okay, we found a great school, check, this is where my child will be, K through 12. And now it's more about, is it working for my child right now? And that's what we're hearing from microschooling families and leaders across the country, is that it's about right now. And so if your kiddo's happy in a micro school that they're in now, perfect. That doesn't mean that it is where they have to be next month. As their needs and interests change and adapt, that's why there's so many great programs. That's why it's so exciting that there's a chance for a child to shift around as they're growing and evolving, that they can find a program that meets their needs.
And Amar, personalization was sort of a key priority for you in creating KaiPod, not only in being able to personalize the learning for each child, their needs, their interests, but also really creating that environment where parents would be empowered to choose a curriculum or an educational approach that reflected their personal preferences and values. You and I have talked before about how there's so much choice and personalization in other areas of our lives, and not nearly the same extent of that in education. And that was a key driver for you. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the personalization piece as it relates to KaiPod.
Happy to. Yeah, this is a core value for us, a real theme behind what we do. Traditional schools are, you get what you get and you don't get upset, right? That's what my 4-year-old repeats to me. And so I think that's what the mentality is of a traditional school. Whereas in smaller, more flexible environments, Shiren's or the organizations Ashley works with or ours, you can unbundle everything and then rebundle it in new ways. So for example, at a KaiPod, you can pick any curriculum from hundreds of options, and we'll help you pick if you're overwhelmed. You can come any number of days you want. You can come at any time you want, and you can start to pick from a variety of physical locations to be. And so all of these choices empower families to say, I think I know what's best for my child, and I'm going to try this. And if it fails, I've learned, and I'm going to try something else. It's not a once a year decision. You can iterate as you go, which in most other parts of our life, we learn by trying. But in school, you got to get it right in kindergarten, otherwise you've missed the on-ramp to private school. That's an incredible amount of pressure for families and for those kids. Because then in 3rd grade, if you say it's not right for you, sorry, you can't change, because you're not going to get admission to another school for 4th grade. So those are the types of wrong incentives we're trying to fix. And the real unbundling of education that's currently happening is allowing entrepreneurs to create new options.
And Shiren, how do you measure success or outcomes in your microschool? And what does success look like in this movement, both at Colossal Academy and with the kind of larger cohort of microschools and education entrepreneurial models in South Florida?
Sure. So Colossal Academy does participate in the national assessment, the NWEA MAP assessment. This is the compromise I need to make in order for to be accessible and affordable for students, so that I can make sure that every child can afford an education that I want to be able to offer. So the compromise is an outdated, antiquated thermometer test called them, not just MAP, but just national tests in general are so limited in what we are testing for. There's 8 intelligences, and we're looking for a microscopic amount of information from children. So that's one way. And my students are doing so well. They are growing so quickly, and they're doing well in the tests. I do 0 test prep. So I might mention it like, oh, next week we're going to take a test, but there's no pressure. It's low stress. And it's not a pass or fail. You don't get to go on to the next grade level. It really, for me, allows me to understand, okay, where might you be entering? Do I need a 4th grade book for you, a 6th grade book? Where's your Lexile? And help me to really, okay, we're having some informational text information, right, that we need to really maybe hone in on. We also do online portfolios. They build their own website, and they are designing their own assessment, right? They're telling me what they're learning. They're saying what has worked, what hasn't worked, what they enjoy. And we have about 5 particular pillars that they need to make sure that they kind of update. But other than that, they're really just doing reflections every week, and they build a beautiful website that they can then own and use and be able to share with other people. Some of them are skills that they could make money from. And so we really push that. And we hope that in the future, they would be able to, the ninth graders own their name domain if they're able to get it and start to build their own website, right? The other thing is we have a lot of contact with families, and often it's like, oh, the lights are back on with my kids. And I work with that age group that, by 10, the lights have gone out, right? They hate school. They never wanted to go to school anymore. We start to see characteristics of like, especially with my like curious and active students who are told to sit down all the time, really short lunch breaks, no time in nature. And then they're like reignited, right? And they're reinfused and they want to learn and they're actively participating. And then, for me as a mom and an educator, the joy, I see them in bliss, like they're joyfully running through the fields, or they are learning about AI and how to create imagery. And when that spark goes off, I see it. And that to me is like, they're learning. They're in it. They're reignited. That to me is something I feel is more of the assessment. But we try to do a holistic assessment of where they are at. And we also have surveys for families to let us know where they're at. So that's kind of the Frankenstein patchwork, but I really want to make sure I get all of the angles and not to miss anything, because we're dynamic and everyone can show in different ways. And so I want to make sure everyone has that opportunity to do that.
I'm glad you brought up joy, Shiren, because as I travel to various microschools and meet education entrepreneurs across the country, joy is that consistent theme, that as diverse as these different models are, the students are so happy to be there. They hate to miss a day. They don't like school vacations to come. They don't want to leave at the end of the day. And that is truly an important metric. And it shows what's possible. It shows that childhood can and should be joyful, and that learning can and should be joyful. And there are spaces that make that happen. So I want to shift gears a bit and start talking about regulatory barriers and some of the barriers to entry and scale that education entrepreneurs often encounter. This was a key theme in the paper that I wrote for Pioneer last fall, as well as the work that I do with State Policy Network and state partners across the country of identifying some of these barriers. And of course, we know that there are barriers to entrepreneurs in all sectors, but education entrepreneurs seem to encounter even more, and that can be challenging to get up and going. And I'd love to hear from each of you about that. So Shiren, back to you. What do you find, or what have you found personally as some of the barriers to starting and growing your microschool? And what are you seeing others in that local cohort of founders encountering?
So, in South Florida, I'm just going to toot our horn really quick, but we have an amazing network of our last meeting was 74 people and 47 innovative educators that are just really pushing the envelope about what's possible and where is learning possible and how learning can be done. It's really fascinating, and I'm so happy to be a part of that. One thing I will say, in Florida, it's really tough to get a space. And I've been super blessed through grant funding with the Vela Ed Fund that I was able to earn a grant to outfit a space. But, some of the regulations make sense when you have 2,000 students, right? Like the amount of safety procedures and the size of the fire panels that we need, when it doesn't make sense in a 1,000 square foot space. But and when there's less than 50 kids, right? Like the policies haven't caught up with the innovation yet. And so often people run out of steam, right? About wanting to have their own space so that they can participate and keep this open for all kinds of family, one income households, right? So that people can actually participate in being involved as a family. So I think just, the regulatory, we haven't really understood, like, what are the regulations around policy, like around microschools? How do they need to run safely? How do we keep our kids safe? And we're continuing to use mammoth buildings that are that don't really match what the learning environment looks like. I guess the other part would really be just around, in my perfect world, we would have ESAs that every child, the dollar would just follow the child and the families could make those decisions so that it's not frightening to make a change and make a move, and that education choice would be available really to all people. I don't think there should be a limit on that, but there are some restrictions. We are super lucky though to be able to participate in Florida with what we do have, and we're moving towards opening it more so that families can make those choices. So I guess the two really are just the space requirements, how to actually occupy space, and the other is to just broaden and make it really accessible to every single child, every single family, to be able to decide where they want to go and have the dollars follow them.
I think it's interesting that, again, you say that kind of some of these regulatory barriers, especially for these innovative models that look quite different from conventional schooling in many ways, as well as those funding barriers. And you're coming from the perspective of being in Florida, which tends to be a lower regulation state, that there's ease of entrepreneurship, ease of starting a small business there compared to many other states, and you're still running into these challenges. And of course, you also still do have some robust school choice policies, and you see the opportunity for more with that universal ESA that's being proposed as well. So wonderful to see what's happening there, hopefully moving in the right direction towards reducing these barriers, not only from the student's perspective in terms of accessibility, but also the entrepreneur's perspective in terms of being able to create these models without running into some barriers. And Amar, you were one of the entrepreneurs who I featured in the Pioneer paper about education entrepreneurship. And one of the points that I made in the paper is that here in Massachusetts, we're good at coming up with ideas, kind of incubating these entrepreneurial ideas, but then they get exported often to states like Florida and elsewhere that tend to be more welcoming to education entrepreneurs. Maybe you could talk a little bit about where you're scaling and sort of what are some of the barriers you've encountered.
Yeah, I'm happy to. It is kind of an unfortunate side effect, right, of being in a state where initially there's a ton of education innovation in theory, but then it finds it harder to scale. I think for us, certainly we've found it easier to scale in states such as Arizona and New Hampshire, where there are lower regulatory barriers and more parent choice friendly policies. Those can often go hand in hand. But I think my answer on this, Kerry, is probably evolving a little bit since we spoke about this last year. I almost think that because microschooling or learning pods are in this gray zone, and there's this patchwork, this confusing patchwork of policy, it also means there's some white space you can go through. There are some creative ways that entrepreneurs can find to get around the policies or be compliant with the policies. In Massachusetts, the team that was helping us get started last year, 2 years ago, they helped us find a really important exemption that allows us to operate in Massachusetts in a way we wouldn't have been able to without that exemption. And so I think the advice to entrepreneurs in Massachusetts, which I believe a bulk of our attendees today is don't give up, even though it may feel like it's a very highly regulated state. The white space or the gray zone is actually exciting in these early stages. And it allows us to prove what's possible rather than say, I guess it'll never work here.
That's great. Yeah. And I think we do have attendees across the country. Pioneer has national reach, but I think you're right that there is sort of this Massachusetts focus. And so maybe I could just push a little bit on that more, Amar, as you look at places to enter with KaiPod, what is appealing about some of those areas?
We usually think about it as like, you're talking about specifically in compliance and regulations?
Just growth in general, as you kind of think about where you're moving, what is informing your decision?
There's usually 4 factors. One is the families, the demographic of the families. And by demographic, I don't mean income, I mean openness to school choice. Arizona, for example, is the world's capital of school choice. Maybe Nevada is actually like the world's capital, but certainly families are used to thinking about alternatives and not merely defaulting to something that happens to be local. So we look at how families think about schools. The second thing we look at is regulation, right? So openness to innovation. The third thing we look at is public funding, because obviously we want to make this option as affordable as possible and as accessible to as many families as possible. and access to public funding is a huge piece of that. And then the fourth thing we look at is staff and teaching, how the caliber of teachers and educators. There are a lot of states, unfortunately, where a lot of teachers are leaving the profession. And so what we want to do is find those people and say, please don't leave teaching, don't go be a curriculum writer or a call center. I've met so many teachers who say, I'm just going to go work at a call center because that pays more. Please don't do that. Stay in education in this new way. And so we look for states where we can actually attract wonderful people to stay in the profession, but just show up differently.
That's great. We're starting to get some questions trickle in. So if you're listening, we will open it up to Q&A in just a few minutes. So please add your question in the Q&A box, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Ashley, as I move to you, you work with microschools and related innovative models across the country. What are you seeing as some of the challenges that the microschool founders you work with encounter as starting or scaling their organizations?
The obstacles that they run into come in the form of barriers in a variety of different ways, right? Everything from state policies to what they're dealing with their local jurisdictions, from zoning. Kerry, you were in Nevada and met with a microschool founder who was telling us about paying $14,000 to get his building rezoned, but he will only ever have 30 students tops, right? So costs like that are a huge barrier to entry. And I think, like Shiren was mentioning, it's difficult to move forward when so many policies are in place for larger institutions, and these are so small. So removing barriers is just incredibly important to us. And also, like Amar said, working in the gray space does allow for some excitement, right? It's exciting to find ways to make this work. And so while there is some caution and some nervousness around that, for sure, we are seeing different ways that people are being innovative in all sorts of exciting ways. And so some of these barriers come from food handlers. If you don't have the proper kitchen and you are ordering pizza and serving it for lunch, that's a reason why somebody might want to step in and try to shut you down. Everything from childcare licensing to Department of Education to, like I mentioned before, zoning. So the barriers are out there, but there are ways around them. Like Amar said, don't give up. Don't get too discouraged, right? There are people out there that want to help. We actually have brought on a senior fellow for legal affairs at the National Microschooling Center who's been able to help with some of this systemic regulatory pushback so that we can do whatever we can to keep these education entrepreneurs there with their families and serving the children that they've got. But yeah, so it's really interesting to see the barriers come in from different levels of regulators.
I love that you're helping to support these microschool founders and entrepreneurs through legal advocacy, pushing back against regulators, often sort of rogue regulators who may not even have the law on their side, but are think that they do. And so kind of pushing back against that, but also thinking from a policy perspective on ways that we can reduce some of these barriers for education entrepreneurs and encourage more innovation, because education is changing, and it's innovators like, again, the ones you support, Ashley and Amar and Shiren, who are making those changes. And it's great to see that. I'd like to pause. I have a few more questions, but I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And we have one from Bill, who says, the elephant in the room, and has been for many years, is cost. Hybrid homeschooling inevitably results in some form of higher costs to families. How are each of you dealing with this, as money following students has been a slow grind? And so it's interesting, and I'm glad that Bill used the term hybrid homeschooling. That's another one of the methods of education where students might attend a learning center or kind of a microschool or co-op a couple of days a week and do the rest of their homeschooling at home or in their communities. It's still under the microschooling umbrella. But yeah, how does that work? How is, maybe we start with you, Ashley, how are you seeing some of your families accessing these models when there isn't perhaps school choice policies that enable funding to follow students?
I also love that hybrid homeschooling was mentioned, and I think that is one very powerful way that microschool founders are keeping their costs low. If they have a hybrid program, it allows them to serve more children, but at not all at the same time, right? So the micro school that my kiddos go to is a hybrid program. And so my children go 3 days a week, and there will never be any more than 20 kiddos there, but those kids come on different days. And so we've got 20 kiddos on the 3 days that my kids are there. And then the other 2 days there are 20 different children. So they're really serving 40 children, which helps keep the cost low, but it also allows families to still have that small learning environment that they're craving. Doing options with facilities is really important for keeping costs low as well. We work with a number of micro school leaders that have found a house of worship to rent space from at low cost, or a dance studio that's only open in the evenings that's happy to have somebody there during the day, and they usually are very flexible with their cost arrangements. We also try to help the entrepreneurs in ways that we can to keep their costs down as well, so that can be passed on to the families. Oftentimes micro school leaders find it difficult to access bulk learning tools, and they have to pay a costly fee to get those learning licenses from like Lexia or Zern or Dreambox or places like that. And so we've been able to negotiate contracts and do the bulk purchasing, so that then our micro school leaders can just take what they need at cost. So that's one way to help keep those costs low. I just think that the folks that are leading these micro schools are really innovative, and cost is a concern, and they are trying to find ways to keep their costs down so that they can pass those savings on to their families. But yeah, and even in states with school choice funds, I like to say that I'm cautiously enthusiastic about it, because sometimes there are strings that are attached there that make it impossible for micro schools to access those funds. So just being mindful of the options that are out there, being thoughtful when you create your budget, and focusing on ways that you can sometimes index your fees as well. So maybe families that can afford to pay a little more are happy to pay a little bit more, and families that can't afford to pay that much, you're able to use some additional funds from scholarships and things like that to bring them in. There's a variety of ways to make it work. And I think as long as everybody's committed to keeping their costs down and helping their families, it's doable for sure.
And Amar, you're operating KaiPod in both states that have school choice policies that enable funding to follow students, as well as in states that don't. How are you managing accessibility, or how are you finding that to be for families?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ashley's answer was incredibly comprehensive. It's exactly the right model of thinking. Keep your costs low and then find ways to make things more affordable. I think more than 2/3 of our students don't pay anything out of pocket to come to KaiPod, because we have decided actively to go to states where there is public funding available for this type of a model. But I think maybe I'll say something slightly controversial, is we also shouldn't be unapologetic about cost means value. That, like, for example, in Massachusetts, I know I cannot serve the base of the pyramid. I know I'm not current, because there's no public funding. I know I cannot serve every single family. But that doesn't mean I feel terrible about what I'm doing. It means I'm going to use this pod to really experiment and build some really wonderful student experiences that I can then export to other states, and I can learn and export. Same thing in Georgia, where, again, at least as of today, there is no public funding, but hopefully very soon there will be. We are learning a lot from those pods and bringing those to other states. So we shouldn't necessarily think it's a terrible thing that costs are higher, because we know that free public education isn't all that great either, right? So I think we have to also remember that value is something that a parent is thinking about.
And Shiren, in terms of accessibility, you're again in Florida, where there are some robust school choice policies, hopefully more coming. But what do you see in terms of accessibility of these models, even nationwide, because you're really seeing what's happening elsewhere too? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that, I got super lucky to be able to be in a state that allows for some of the dollars to follow the children. But I do want to make mention that my tuition is substantially lower than what the district pays per pupil. And even then, it's like being able to make sure that what we spend actually goes straight to the child. Whereas when the district is spending money, it doesn't necessarily filter into the salaries of the teachers, for sure, and then actually make it to the actual child. I also want to make mention that families have to make education a priority, and we do have an equitable pay scale. It has to be their top priority. I mean, that's what it is in my household. I come from a teaching background, so education is the top priority. And we don't have nice cars. We don't have nice furniture. But what we do make sure that we have is a quality education, because that's what where we're spending our money and where we're investing. And so there's like two folds of it, making it accessible, a dollar amount that people can afford, while people are also meeting us and saying, this is the priority, this is the urgency, this is what my family wants and needs. And so I think those are kind of like the synthesizing, meeting the families where they are. I do a lot of work of fundraising, looking for grants to be able to offer scholarships for students, so that we can bring the price point down. But every family does have to contribute some monetary amount, as well as time in the school. There's no regulated time, but we're saying, hey, we're going to be mulching this weekend. Anybody else up for it? And families want to contribute to the community in that way. And so, I think making it a priority, like this is the priority for our family. And yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that when I talk to education entrepreneurs and founders across the country in both states that have school choice policies and those that don't, we're seeing this movement happen everywhere. We're seeing vibrant hubs of education entrepreneurship, both in places with school choice policies and those without. And accessibility is a key priority for the entrepreneurs I talk about, regardless of the state that they're in. And like you said, Shiren, even if these founders are operating in states without school choice policies, they use sliding scale tuition, they do fundraising, they rely on private philanthropy, the VELA Education Fund, which some of you have received microgrants from, to really activate non-traditional learning models across the country and help to make these programs more affordable and accessible to families has been a big contributor to that too. So there are ways of doing this, and it's certainly a key priority from what I've seen of entrepreneurs. So if others who are listening and watching have questions, please feel free to add them. But I have another question I'd like to ask for the panelists, and we'll start with you, Ashley. What do you see as the future of microschooling? Obviously, you are running the National Microschooling Center. You are definitely seeing what's happening nationwide. Is the future bright?
It is bright. It's exciting. There's we're hearing from so many people throughout the country just doing things that I couldn't be more thrilled with the microschool my kids are in, but then I'm also like, oh, wait, hang on, maybe I want to come over here. I mean, we were in Florida and my kids were lucky enough to go spend a date with Shiren, and it was so exciting. So the future is bright. It's exciting. It's full of people that are permissionless educators stepping in and creating solutions for their communities without waiting for permission to do it. And that's exactly, I think, what the country needs right now.
Amar, what do you think? What do you think the future of microschooling, pods, these alternative models looks like? And how does it perhaps fit into the larger kind of conventional system too?
I, of course, agree the future is bright. I always think about it as if education is a market, there's supply, there's demand, and then there's like the market itself. Demand is families. Never before in history have so many parents said, okay, I'm going to take this time to do something different. If you think about supply, never have as many education entrepreneurs stood up and said, I'm going to build something that's local, that's different, that is actually a holistic solution to kids. And if you think about the market itself, never in history has funding followed the kids at such a scale. So all the ingredients are there. It's just about people putting it all together. That's core to our strategies. How do we enable so many more entrepreneurs to launch their own microschools? It's core to what Ashley's team is doing at the National Microschooling Center. And so, I think the traditional system, as you said, it will realize this, like it will realize that the ingredients are there now for people to create their own model. And I think slowly the system will start to adapt. I just fear it might be too late before they do.
And maybe I can have you talk a little bit more about that too, Amar, because you're really helping to activate education entrepreneurs, people who want to start microschools, by supporting them, because it's often, entrepreneurial parents and teachers who may not have ever really thought about being an entrepreneur before, never really run a business before, and you're helping to give them that motivation, encouragement, and those resources to do that. Could you talk a little bit about your efforts there?
Yeah, that's a program called KaiPod Catalyst, which is an accelerator for entrepreneurs to launch their own microschools of any flavor in any community. I actually noticed 2 of our Catalyst founders on this call today, so hello. And the idea behind that program is through 18 weeks, we sort of open up our entire playbook of how to launch a microschool, not just setting the vision and coming up with a marketing strategy, but really tactical things, really understanding local compliance, building a financial model, finding someone to review your lease, finding someone to get you insurance. We're really trying to solve that soup to nuts challenge of starting your own school, and then providing you years of support after that to grow it, to run it in a streamlined fashion so that you can lower your costs and affordability for families.
And Shiren, you are serving this community building role of supporting aspiring education entrepreneurs in South Florida. You mentioned at your previous gathering, you had almost 75 people attending, just really a lot of momentum and excitement there. What is your sense of the microschooling movement, not only in the greater Fort Lauderdale area, but nationally?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my bet's on microschools. I really do think it's the way forward, where we're able to sink into each child, personalize it, and allow them to have a individual learning plan, right? That they can achieve and feel super self-actualized at some point. But in South Florida and in Wichita too, I'm going to give them a shout out too, because I just love what's happening. We're not just only micro schools. There's all these diversity of educators that have left education, or moms or dads that have decided, I'm going to be a coach. I'm just going to coach kids how to do archery. And then they filter through our micro schools or co-ops or whatever the larger pod might look like. We have Surf Skate Science, which I'm always just such a huge fan. We have Home Economics. We have Kind Academy that's down here, which is like our soup. And I would say like the innovative, I don't even know the word quite to give them, but they're like the specialists, are kind of like the sprinkles on the ice cream, and they bring in their special techniques. So whether that's STEAM and robotics, or in our case, it's art with Lele Arts, and they go to the ocean and they take out all this trash and then they make art with the kids. So if you're leaving the education system, don't leave, right? Like Amar was saying, stay with us. And there's all these amazing options. If it's not a micro school, it could be just serve as a magic teacher. Like if that's what you thought you were going to be when you got into education and you sat down to Ed 101, then go do that. Really, really sink into what the vision was. What was your why to go into education, and go do that. If it's a typing teacher, go do that. We're all looking for you, and needing people to pour in their specialties, right? So I'm super excited what's happening down here in South Florida, and then Wichita is another amazing hub of innovative education. We're really hoping that we'll be able to have a conference of educators that are innovative. So we can just share tips and skills, and really hope there'll be more kids at these conferences, because we're talking about education. So I want to activate that voice as well, and so that they can be contributing to, as we are shifting the education system into the future, what do they want, right? Like activating that voice in the choices that we make as adults.
I'm glad you brought up Wichita, Kansas as well, Shiren. I was able to do a case study for the VELA Education Fund last fall that spotlighted these 2 hubs of education entrepreneurship, 2 of many, obviously Las Vegas, another area where there's a tremendous amount of energy around microschooling and several hundred students being served. But you can look at more information about these hubs of education entrepreneurship at velaedfund.org's website to see what some of these innovators are doing. It's really such an exciting time. And I know that Jamie was having some difficulty technically. We had a nor'easter come through here in the Boston area yesterday, and still dealing with some power outages. So he may not be able to kind of wrap us up. But I just really am so grateful to have the 3 of you here to talk about microschooling and education entrepreneurship. I do also believe that the future is bright for these decentralized, individualized educational models that that are being driven by parents and educators who are looking to solve a problem for their own family as well as for their local community. And just that hyper-local focus on transforming education has national reach, and it's exciting to see where this will all go. So Ashley Soifer from the National Microschooling Center, Amar Kumar from KaiPod Learning, and Shiren Rattigan from Colossal Academy, thank you all for being here. Thank you again to Jamie and the Pioneer Institute for hosting today's webinar. And again, really exciting to see where this all leads. And thank you to all of our audience members for being here. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks.